My name is Joe. I come straight from New York, and I want to talk about resetting expectations about after the crazy 2 years we had in e-commerce. So for the last 2 years, we've been living in a lie, and everyone who's following e-commerce, everyone who's following marketing has probably at some point seen charts like this. This is probably the most famous chart in e-commerce over the last 12 months or so, where e-commerce was growing very, very slowly for decades. But then just in a single quarter, it achieved growth. It would have taken probably 5 years or so. So this little blip right there is the lie I'm talking about. Why is this a lie? What we thought is going to happen to e-commerce is that the growth of e-commerce penetration, both in the US and in Europe and elsewhere, is going to look something like this, where after the bump of e-commerce, we're just going to continue growing beyond that. If you've been paying any attention to e-commerce, you probably realize this didn't happen. This chart today doesn't look anything like we thought it's going to look like. The COVID bump ended up decreasing over time. So if you look at e-commerce penetration today, it's actually been declining every quarter since the initial COVID bump. And if you look at the trend line, which was leading up to e-commerce for the last, let's say, 5 years, we are almost back to the trend line. So initially we thought that the COVID boost is going to accelerate e-commerce, it's going to increase penetration for all of us selling online, but actually as months goes on, we're getting closer and closer to the trend line we were on for a very long time. Which, if you're working in this industry, this feels disappointing, I guess. But actually, two things are true at the same time. E-commerce is both smaller than the initial boost might have suggested. So today, we would probably be expecting, 25% market share. This is not true. E-commerce is much smaller than the initial boost would have suggested. But actually, it's also much bigger than the penetration number implies. So two things are true at the same time. It's both smaller and bigger. Why? Because obviously e-commerce penetration is a percentage of overall retail sales. As much as e-commerce was boosted, so was offline retail. And e-commerce is much bigger than we thought it's going to be, because actually if you look at e-commerce dollars spent, e-commerce in the US right now is almost at $1 trillion run rate, which means every year or this year, more than $1 trillion will be spent online. And if you actually look at this chart, which starts at 2001, so a very long time ago, there is a massive COVID boost. And this is like the trick in these charts, is that e-commerce as a penetration, as a percentage, has been declining now and catching up to the trend line, but actually dollars spent is still much, much, much higher. So e-commerce dollars right now are still 25% higher than the trend line would have suggested. And 25% is a huge number. So this year, probably $200 billion extra dollars will be spent shopping online, at least in the US, than the trend line before COVID would have suggested. This is massive. But the hype, the initial chart, the lie I was talking about, the hype caused everyone in this industry to really overinvest and buy too much inventory, build too many warehouses, hire too many employees, and just overextend the hype. This is now causing a lot of issues. If you've been reading the news about Amazon, Amazon has said that they built too many warehouses. If you've been following the results of Target, Target said they have too much inventory. If you've been following a lot of the kind of tech-related companies in the space, now everyone is doing layoffs. So all of a sudden, because we followed the lie, we followed the kind of high e-commerce percentage, we assumed it's going to continue. But these charts are ultimately not the most important thing, because meanwhile, as e-commerce was kind of trying to understand, as we were trying to understand, is e-commerce going to grow, how it's going to look like in the future, everything else got a lot more difficult and a lot more expensive. So sourcing, fulfillment, advertising, all the talks before in this conference, everyone talked about how everything now is more expensive, everything is more difficult. So for example, before COVID, importing something from China to the US would typically cost $2,000 for a container. In the peak a couple months ago, a container to the US was costing $20,000. So now fulfillment, which was for a very long time a kind of on-demand operation, is now costing 10 times as more. At the same time, it's taking 3 times longer. And it's not just fulfillment which is broken, but if you look at the container rates, they really spiked in the same time as e-commerce was really exploding, and they're still maintaining somewhere close to that level. But it's not just supply chains which are affected. If you've been following the news about Apple changes in their advertising attribution, as well as if you sell kind of through direct-to-consumer e-commerce, you probably have realized that now Facebook advertising, Instagram advertising, TikTok advertising, any advertising which happens on the phone is now less effective as well as more expensive because of privacy changes Apple made. So kind of one of the key things that I'm trying to say is that e-commerce is both bigger right now, and it's also much more difficult to be successful because everything is more expensive and everything is less efficient. So what are the challenges today I think everyone is facing, both people in marketing departments as well as kind of working on inventory as well as beyond that. Obviously importing from China is still very slow, much slower, and more expensive. This looks like it's recovering pretty quickly now, and maybe by the end of this year it's going to get closer to the pre-COVID levels, but it's still much more expensive. Advertising is less effective. If you sell direct-to-consumer, this is not going to improve. Google is also making changes to privacy, which are going to make Facebook ads on Android phones also less effective. This is not going to change, unfortunately, for all of us. Margins are getting compressed. So because of supply chain issues, because of advertising issues, because of delays in imports, margins are getting smaller and smaller. Again, unclear how well that's going to improve over time. And then ultimately, because of these comparisons to 2021, which was still boosted by COVID, year-over-year growth is now looking very bad for many of e-commerce businesses. So if you're trying to sell your business or you're trying to raise extra capital, year-over-year growth now is still looking very bad. And then we still have a lot of uncertainty in the future of many more issues to come. What are those issues? Inflation is rising. There might be a real financial recession coming, and these are ultimately the things which are going to affect e-commerce, and we still don't really know what to do about them. But it's obviously not all just bad news. Many things did change during COVID, and many things in online retail did really kind of were fundamentally disrupted. A great example of that is online grocery. So in many countries, online grocery and even restaurant delivery was a very small industry, but thanks to COVID, thanks to lockdowns, that was boosted by a lot, and that's one of the categories which ended up changing quite a lot. So if you sell clothing, maybe e-commerce penetration didn't materially change, but if you sell grocery goods and they're getting delivered through online grocery platforms, that's obviously a material change. So COVID boost ended up being very, very different for very different categories, and ultimately it really depends on which category you're selling in and which category you're working in to see what are the results of it. So how is e-commerce going to look like post-COVID? I think this is ultimately the most important thing for all of us, is trying to understand what are the things we should be doing right now to survive, let's say, the next 12 months or the next 18 months, as well as understand what we should be thinking about to kind of put ourselves in the best position to succeed. For a very long time, it looked like direct-to-consumer is going to be the solution to everything. The solution to all the problems everyone has ever had was just, let's cut out all the retail stores, let's replace kind of all people in stores with direct-to-consumer websites. That's the solution to everything. Well, now with Facebook advertising inefficiencies, Apple and Google changes, that's looking more and more difficult to scale. Social commerce, video commerce, I mean, we just had this amazing presentation about TikTok. These are all incredibly strong platforms which are driving advertising, but it's also unclear of how close are we getting to being able to transact through these platforms in a material way. And then there's obviously major companies, specifically Facebook, trying to push us onto the metaverse, saying maybe in the future we will actually be selling through the metaverse, whatever that would mean. Like, all of these things are very, very exciting, I think, and especially if you're working in marketing, these are the sort of things you can build a lot of things on top of. But I think for short term and medium term, these are probably not the things which are most important to focus on, as well as these are the sort of things which are probably going to be very difficult for many companies to do if you're trying to maintain profitability and if you're trying to achieve sustainable growth, because these are the sort of the long-term bets which are still going to take time to play out. So what are the things which I think are much more important today and which are, I think, ultimately the sort of the core things to focus on? And I think the core things to focus on today are obviously all the fundamentals. Fundamentals which do not depend on interest rates increasing or the recession happening or the supply chains affecting. Because today, if your inventory forecasting and management is being improved, that's actually much more important than solving social commerce. So I think, like, if you're an online retailer business, it's much more valuable to invest effort into trying to figure out inventory forecasting, purchase order forecasting, sourcing, than it is to figure out social media ads, fundamentals. I also think advertising and attribution is now becoming like a secret art. Because of privacy changes on platforms, the way you capture first-party data is wide open, and you can do it in so many different ways, and there's so many different advertising platforms that now I'm starting to see direct-to-consumer businesses approaching advertising very, very differently between different companies, and you can't just rely on a sort of a plug-and-play solution built on Facebook. And ultimately, we've been talking about multi-channel for a very long time. That was a solution to end all solutions. And for a very long time, we didn't really have to think about it that much because e-commerce was growing anyway, and you can just throw up products on Amazon, you can throw up products on Shopify, and that was all that it took. But now with e-commerce growth slowing, if you want to show growth, you have to find more channels to sell in more countries, perhaps including physical stores. And all of these things are now so much more important than they probably were in the past. So ultimately, like, I always try to think of a single takeaway I'm trying to tell, and I think this is probably the most important, is that we thought e-commerce is going to get much, much bigger, and then everything will become easier, because it's so much easier to sell in a much bigger market. And during COVID, we thought that because e-commerce got bigger, and obviously the number of competitors didn't increase overnight, the life of everyone will become much easier. That didn't happen. E-commerce got a little bit bigger, but then everything got harder. Sourcing got harder, advertising got harder, inventory management got harder, everything got harder. So this is the comical thing about the COVID boost. It did boost e-commerce a little bit, but then it also left everything else much, much, much harder. So that's why I think my finishing thought is that ultimately e-commerce is both bigger and smaller than we thought it would be, and e-commerce is both bigger and smaller than the kind of pre-COVID or post-COVID trends would have suggested. But ultimately, these are not the most important things. The most important things are that many of the fundamentals today are a little bit different than they were in the past, and because of the challenges we're still facing, and we still have no idea what's going to be like in the future, we still have no idea what normal is going to look like, we still have no idea if people are going to continue working from home or people are going to go back to offices. We have no idea what normal is. And that's why I think it's the most important thing today is to nail the fundamentals. Meaning inventory management is more important than social commerce. Nailing profitability is more important than succeeding on the metaverse. And for that, thank you for your time. If you have any more questions, shoot me an email.